The man in the gray uniform stood by the glass doors long before the sun fully rose over the city, and when the first wave of executives arrived, he opened the door for each one with the same quiet nod he had given every morning for months. They laughed at the frayed cuffs of his jacket as they passed, one of them muttering that the company really should update its security contracts, and the woman at the front of the group barely glanced at him as she said he would do well to remember his place. What none of them knew, what not a single person in that gleaming lobby understood, was that the man they mocked had been watching their company, and watching them, for longer than any of them could imagine. 10 minutes later, the chairman of the board walked to the front of the largest conference room in the building and said a single sentence that stopped every heart in the room. He asked everyone to please welcome the founder of the corporation, a man named Marcus Carter. Every weekday morning, long before the elevators began their steady climb and the espresso machines in the break room hissed to life, Marcus Carter stood at the entrance of Holloway Tower, with his hand resting lightly on the brass door handle, ready to greet whoever walked through. He smiled at everyone, without exception, whether they were junior analysts clutching coffee cups or senior directors moving too fast to notice him at all. He called the delivery drivers by name and helped them wheel heavy boxes across the marble floor when their carts caught on the threshold. When a stack of folders slipped from a flustered intern's arms, he was already crouching to gather them before she could apologize. Nobody in that building knew that the quiet man in the ill-fitting uniform had once walked the halls of Harvard as a young economics student with nothing but ambition and a second-hand suit, and certainly nobody guessed that his personal fortune could have purchased the very tower they worked in several times over. To the employees of Holloway Corporation, Marcus Carter was simply the older security guard who worked the morning shift, a pleasant fixture of the lobby, who remembered everyone's coffee order, but whose own life seemed to exist in a kind of comfortable blur. He never spoke of his past, never mentioned family, never let slip so much as a hint about where he had come from or where he intended to go. Instead, he watched. He noticed which managers said "good morning" to the cleaning staff, and which ones walked past them as though they were furniture. He noticed which directors held the elevator door and which ones let it close in someone's face without a flicker of concern. He kept no written record at first, only a quiet mental ledger that grew heavier with each passing week, and more than a few employees began to wonder, in passing conversations by the coffee machine, why a man so composed and so clearly capable would spend his days standing at a door. There was something almost meditative in the way Marcus carried himself, a stillness that made people either comfortable or unsettled, depending on how much they had to hide. Younger employees liked him instantly, drawn to his patience and the way he listened when they talked about their weekends or their worries about a looming performance review. Older employees, the ones who had been at the company through several rounds of leadership changes, treated him with a kind of wary respect, sensing without being able to explain it, that this man had seen more of the world than his uniform suggested. He never corrected anyone who assumed he had simply fallen on hard times, never bothered to explain that his choice to stand at that door each morning was entirely his own. All he did was watch and wait, and let the company reveal itself to him one small interaction at a time. Some mornings, before the building filled with its usual noise, Marcus arrived nearly an hour early, using the quiet time to walk the empty hallways alone, running his fingers along walls that had once been bare concrete when he first signed the lease for a much smaller office decades earlier. He remembered the exact spot where his first desk had stood, a second-hand table he had bought for almost nothing, and the exact window where he used to sit late at night, reworking numbers that refused to balance, no matter how many times he tried. None of the people who now filled these halls with their tailored suits and confident strides had any idea that the marble beneath their expensive shoes had once been a stretch of unfinished floor, where a much younger version of the same man had slept more nights than he cared to admit, unwilling to go home until the work was done. That history lived only in him now, folded quietly beneath the uniform, and he found a strange comfort in carrying it alone through those early morning hours before the world woke up around him. The questions began quietly at first, murmured between coworkers waiting for the elevator or shared over lunch in the cafeteria on the 14th floor. Someone remembered that Marcus had once fixed a jammed printer in the mailroom with an ease that suggested more than passing familiarity with complex machinery. Someone else recalled a conversation in which he had casually referenced a merger from decades earlier, with a level of detail that seemed almost impossible for an outsider to know. A young associate named Ethan Walsh, only 2 years out of business school, once asked Marcus outright why a man with his obvious intelligence chose to spend his mornings opening doors, and Marcus had only smiled and said that everyone had their reasons, and that his would become clear in time. The uncertainty around him grew slowly, the way a rumor grows, until it became less a question and more a quiet, persistent curiosity that followed him through the halls he guarded so faithfully. It was into this atmosphere of quiet observation that Vanessa Sinclair arrived each morning like a small, controlled storm, and everyone in the building adjusted their posture the moment her black sedan pulled up outside. She was 45 years old, sharp-featured and sharper-tongued, and she had built her identity as Chief Operating Officer around the idea that appearances were everything and that respect was something to be extracted rather than earned. Her assistants trailed behind her in a practiced formation, 2 of them holding tablets and 1 holding an umbrella, regardless of the weather, and a private security detail walked a few paces back, scanning the lobby as though danger might be lurking behind the potted ferns. She measured people instantly and without apology, sorting them by the cost of their clothing and the confidence of their stride, and anyone who failed her silent inspection simply ceased to exist in her field of vision. On the morning everything began to change, Vanessa swept through the revolving doors with her heels striking the marble in short, impatient clicks, and Marcus, as he did every day, stepped forward to hold the inner door open for her. She did not look at him. She did not so much as break stride. All she said, without turning her head, was that he should get out of her way, and the words landed with the casual cruelty of someone who had said similar things 1,000 times before without ever considering the person on the receiving end. A junior director walking a few steps behind her laughed and asked, loudly enough for half the lobby to hear, whether the company had hired a new security guard, as though the question itself were the punchline. Another executive chimed in that the man certainly looked like he worked hard, delivering the compliment with a smirk that made clear it was no compliment at all. Vanessa turned then, finally acknowledging Marcus with a glance that swept from his scuffed shoes to his graying hair, and she said, with a small, satisfied smile, that perhaps this was exactly the kind of position suited to a man like him. The small crowd of executives laughed together, the sound bouncing off the marble walls and glass partitions, and for a moment the entire lobby seemed to exist only to witness one man's humiliation. Marcus said nothing. He simply held the door a moment longer, allowed the group to pass through, and let the corner of his mouth lift into the same patient smile he offered everyone, friend or otherwise. Somewhere near the security desk, a young receptionist named Claire Dawson watched the exchange with her jaw tight and her hands still on her keyboard. And she was not the only one in that lobby who felt a small, uncomfortable knot form in her stomach at the sight of it. The days that followed unfolded in much the same rhythm. Small kindnesses from Marcus, meeting careless disregard from those who considered themselves above him, and the pattern repeated itself so consistently that it began to feel less like coincidence and more like a test the entire company was quietly failing. He helped a woman from accounting carry a stack of banker's boxes to her car during a sudden downpour, holding his own jacket over her head while his uniform soaked through in the rain. He guided a confused client from a rival firm through the labyrinth of the building's east wing when the directory screens malfunctioned, walking 3 extra blocks out of his way to make sure the man found his meeting. He found a lost leather wallet on the lobby floor one afternoon, thick with cash and credit cards, and returned it in full to a flustered junior executive who barely offered a word of thanks before hurrying off to his next appointment. Not one of these small acts of decency earned Marcus so much as a nod of recognition from the people who mattered most in the company's official hierarchy, and he seemed, if anything, entirely unbothered by the omission. A young employee named Sophie Ramirez, who worked in the marketing department and had taken a particular liking to the quiet man at the door, asked him one afternoon what kind of work he had done before this job, genuinely curious about the life that seemed to exist behind his calm exterior. Marcus considered the question for a moment before answering that he had done a great many things in his life, more than most people would guess, and that each one had taught him something he still carried with him. Vanessa happened to be passing at that exact moment, close enough to catch the tail end of the conversation, and she laughed under her breath as she continued walking, remarking to no one in particular that it must have been quite the career of daydreaming. The comment stung more than Vanessa likely intended, though intention had never been something she spent much time considering when it came to people she viewed as beneath her notice, and Sophie's cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger on Marcus's behalf. He, for his part, remained entirely unmoved, his expression unchanged, his posture still relaxed against the doorframe, as though the comment had simply passed through him without leaving a mark. There was something almost unsettling about his composure, a steadiness that suggested he had weathered far worse insults from far more powerful people than a mid-level executive with an expensive haircut and an inflated sense of her own importance. Sophie would later tell a friend that watching Marcus absorb these small cruelties without flinching felt like watching a man who already knew the ending of a story that everyone else was still trying to read. As the weeks passed, the company began preparing for its most important event of the year, a shareholder meeting that would determine the direction of several major initiatives and, more quietly, the fate of certain executives whose performance had come under scrutiny from the board. Vanessa, who had positioned herself as the driving force behind the company's recent aggressive expansion, felt the pressure of the coming meeting more acutely than she let on, and her already sharp temper grew shorter with each passing day. She called meetings that stretched late into the evening, snapped at assistants who brought her the wrong coffee order, and made it unmistakably clear to the entire security staff that no one without explicit authorization would be permitted anywhere near the executive floor during the days leading up to the shareholder gathering. Marcus received this instruction the same way he received all instructions, with a calm nod and no visible reaction, though something in his eyes suggested he understood the moment for what it truly was. On the morning of the meeting itself, with the building humming with a nervous, electric energy that even the most junior employees could feel in the air, Marcus did something no one expected. He left his post at the main entrance and walked, with unhurried steps, directly into the private corridor leading to the largest conference room on the top floor, the very room where board members and senior executives were already beginning to gather. Vanessa spotted him the moment he crossed the threshold, and her reaction was immediate and furious, her voice cutting across the room with a sharpness that drew every eye toward the two of them. She told him, in front of easily a dozen senior leaders, that she had specifically instructed security that no unauthorized personnel were permitted on this floor, and she demanded to know who had let him through. Marcus met her gaze without flinching, his voice as calm and even as it had been every single morning for months, and he simply said that he had been invited. The room fell into a strange, uncomfortable silence, broken only by a director near the window who asked, half amused and half genuinely curious, exactly who had extended such an invitation to a security guard. Marcus allowed the smallest hint of a smile to cross his face, as he told them that everyone in the room would understand soon enough, and something in the certainty of his tone made even Vanessa hesitate for just a fraction of a second before her anger reasserted itself. That hesitation did not last, and within moments, Vanessa had recovered her composure fully, turning to gesture sharply at two members of the building's security team who had followed the commotion up to the executive floor. She ordered them to remove Marcus from the room immediately, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to having her commands obeyed without question. Marcus did not resist as the two younger guards approached him, did not raise his voice or his hands, did not do anything that could have been mistaken for defiance. He only asked, with the same quiet steadiness he had carried all morning, whether the board had arrived yet, a question that seemed to catch everyone in the room off guard with its strange specificity. Vanessa laughed then, a short, incredulous sound that carried more contempt than amusement, and she asked him directly whether he actually believed he was going to meet with the board of directors. The absurdity of the idea seemed to delight her, and several executives standing nearby joined in the laughter, the sound rippling through the room in a wave of shared condescension. Someone near the back of the room had their phone raised, quietly recording the scene as though it were simply entertainment, a small cruelty captured for later amusement rather than anything resembling concern. The atmosphere in that room, usually so carefully controlled and professionally restrained, had curdled into something uglier, a kind of collective contempt directed at a man who had done nothing to deserve it, beyond standing quietly and refusing to raise his voice. For a brief moment, as the laughter continued around him, Marcus allowed his gaze to travel slowly across the room, taking in each face in turn. The young analysts who laughed because everyone else was laughing, the senior directors who laughed because it cost them nothing, and Vanessa herself, whose laughter carried the particular satisfaction of someone convinced she had already won. He recognized something in that moment that none of them could yet see, a kind of quiet inevitability settling over the room, like weather rolling in from a great distance, still unseen but already impossible to stop. He said nothing more, offered no protest, made no attempt to defend himself against the ridicule, because he understood, better than anyone present, that the truth arriving in its own time would speak far louder than anything he could say in his own defense at that moment. It was in the middle of this scene, with two security guards still hovering uncertainly near Marcus and Vanessa still basking in the laughter of her colleagues, that a long black car pulled up to the entrance of Holloway Tower far below, unnoticed by everyone caught up in the drama unfolding on the top floor. Harold Benson, 68 years old, and chairman of the board for nearly 2 decades, stepped out of the car with the deliberate, unhurried movements of a man who had long ago stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. He walked through the lobby, greeted the receptionist by name, and made his way toward the elevator, entirely unaware of the small storm of humiliation being directed at an old friend several floors above him. When Harold stepped off the elevator and into the conference room, the laughter died almost instantly, replaced by the particular hush that falls over a room when its most powerful occupant has just walked in unannounced. He scanned the gathered executives with a brief, practiced glance before asking, in a voice that carried easily, despite its calm register, where Marcus was. For a moment, no one in the room understood the question, and Vanessa, still riding the momentum of her earlier triumph, assumed the chairman was simply asking after the whereabouts of the security guard who had caused the disruption. She told him, with a note of satisfaction still lingering in her voice, that the man in question had not yet arrived, gesturing vaguely toward the door as though the matter were already settled. Harold's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle straightening that suggested the room had misunderstood something fundamental. He clarified, slowly and clearly, that he was not asking about a security guard at all, but about the founder of the company, the man he had come specifically to see. The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of confusion spreading across the faces of everyone present, and Vanessa's confident smile faltered for the first time that morning. She looked around the room as though searching for someone to explain the joke to her, and found only silence and the growing realization that no one else understood it either. It was then that Harold turned, his gaze settling on the quiet man still standing near the doorway, still flanked by 2 uncertain security guards who had no idea what to do with the instructions they had been given only minutes earlier. Harold gestured toward Marcus and said, simply and without any trace of doubt, that the man they were looking for was standing right there. A wave of confusion swept through the room, executives turning to look at one another and then back at Marcus, as though trying to reconcile 2 entirely incompatible images of the same person. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound, the first time in longer than anyone in that room could remember that she had found herself without a single word to say. Harold crossed the room without hesitation, his steps carrying the easy familiarity of a man greeting someone he had known for many years, and he extended his hand to Marcus with genuine warmth in his expression. The 2 men shook hands, and then, in a gesture that seemed to shock the room even more than the handshake itself, they embraced briefly, 2 old friends reunited, after some private absence that no one else in the room could account for. Harold stepped back and told Marcus that the entire board had been waiting for him, his voice thick with an emotion that seemed to surprise even the chairman himself. Marcus simply nodded, his expression as calm and unreadable as it had been throughout the entire ordeal, though something in his eyes suggested this moment carried more weight for him than his composure let on. Harold turned then to address the room, and the executives who had been laughing only minutes before now stood in absolute silence, waiting for an explanation that felt increasingly urgent with every passing second. He began by telling them that 30 years earlier, a young man with nothing but a degree from Harvard and an unshakable belief in doing business differently had founded the company that now employed every single person in that room. That young man, Harold explained, had built the foundation of everything they now took for granted, had written the very first mission statement that still hung, largely ignored, in the lobby downstairs. He told them that this same man had eventually sold the majority of his shares decades ago, stepping back from daily operations to pursue other interests, but had never fully let go, remaining to this day the single largest individual shareholder in the entire corporation. The silence that followed Harold's words was different from the silence that had come before it, heavier and more complete, the kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone present is simultaneously recalculating every assumption they had ever made. Vanessa's face had gone pale. The confident color drained from her cheeks as the full weight of the morning's events began to settle over her, and she found herself unable to meet Marcus's eyes, even as everyone else in the room turned to stare at him, with something between astonishment and dawning horror. Several executives who had laughed loudest earlier now stood frozen, their earlier amusement replaced by a creeping, uncomfortable understanding of exactly what they had done and to whom they had done it. The young man who had raised his phone to record the earlier scene lowered it slowly, his expression shifting from amusement to something closer to dread. Marcus allowed the silence to stretch for a long moment before he finally spoke, his voice as measured and unhurried as it had been every single morning at that front door, and he began, quite simply, by explaining why he had returned. He told them that he had come back to the company he built not to reclaim power or to remind anyone of his history, but to understand something far more important, something that no financial report or quarterly earnings call could ever reveal to him. He wanted to know, he said, whether the company still carried within it the values he had tried to build into its foundation all those years ago, whether the people who now ran it in his absence had preserved the spirit that had once made it something he was proud to call his own. To find that answer, Marcus explained, he had chosen not to announce himself, not to walk through the front doors as the founder returning to inspect his legacy, but instead to become invisible in the most literal sense, to take up a position that most people in the building would walk past without a second glance. He had put on the uniform of a security guard, and he had stood at that door every single morning, watching, listening, and learning things about his own company that no boardroom presentation could ever have shown him. He kept no formal records at first, he admitted, only the quiet observations of a man determined to see his company as it truly was, rather than as it presented itself in carefully polished reports and rehearsed presentations to shareholders. Over the course of those months, Marcus told the room, he had watched with growing concern as certain patterns emerged, patterns that painted a picture far removed from the values he had once poured into this company's founding documents. He had seen arrogance dressed up as confidence, casual cruelty disguised as decisiveness, and a persistent, corrosive habit of looking down on anyone whose job title did not carry sufficient weight to warrant basic human courtesy. He had watched executives dismiss the concerns of frontline workers without so much as pretending to listen, had seen managers take credit for the labor of people they would not deign to learn the names of, and had witnessed, more times than he cared to count, the particular blend of contempt and condescension that Vanessa Sinclair had displayed toward him nearly every single morning. He spoke of the cleaning staff who worked through the night and were treated as though they were invisible by the very people whose offices they kept spotless, and of the customer service representatives who absorbed abuse from clients, while their supervisors offered nothing in the way of support or protection. He described watching junior employees stay late into the evening, unpaid and unacknowledged, while senior leadership left promptly at 5 to attend dinners that cost more than those same employees earned in a week. Each of these observations, Marcus said, had chipped away at something inside him, a slow accumulation of disappointment that had, by the final weeks of his time at that door, hardened into a firm and unshakable resolve to act. What none of them realized, Marcus continued, was that his quiet presence at that door had never been without purpose, and that the months he had spent watching had produced far more than memories and disappointment. He had begun, quietly and methodically, to document what he witnessed, gathering video footage from the building's own security systems, collecting written statements from employees who trusted him enough to speak honestly about their experiences, and compiling a record so thorough and so damning that it could not be dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding. He had brought this evidence to Harold weeks earlier, in private, and together the two men had decided that the truth needed to be revealed, not quietly in a closed session, but here, in front of everyone whose conduct it concerned. The room absorbed this revelation in near total silence, the weight of what was coming settling over the gathered executives like a physical presence, and Vanessa, for perhaps the first time in her professional life, found herself with nowhere to hide from the consequences of her own behavior. Marcus turned to her directly, his expression not cruel or triumphant, but simply steady, the same expression he had worn every morning he had held that door open for her without complaint. He told her, and the room, that a company does not collapse because of shifting markets or clever competitors, no matter how often executives blamed external forces for internal failures. A company collapses, he said, when the people leading it forget how to treat the human beings who make its existence possible in the first place. The board convened its formal review within the hour, moving from the conference room to a private chamber where the evidence Marcus had gathered was presented in full detail to every member present. Vanessa sat through the presentation with her composure cracking further with each new piece of footage, each new statement from an employee she had dismissed or humiliated, without a second thought over the preceding months. There was the footage of her turning away a distressed customer service representative who had asked for basic support after an abusive phone call, the recording of her mocking a junior analyst's accent in front of his colleagues, and dozens of smaller moments that, taken together, painted an unmistakable portrait of someone who viewed her position as license for cruelty rather than responsibility for leadership. She was not alone in facing this reckoning, and as the review continued, several other senior directors found themselves confronted with their own patterns of behavior, moments they had likely forgotten entirely, but which Marcus had recorded with careful, unemotional precision. A director named Gregory Holloway, no relation to the building's namesake but equally comfortable in his sense of entitlement, was shown footage of himself berating a maintenance worker over a broken elevator that had nothing to do with the man's actual responsibilities. Another executive, a woman named Patricia Weller, who had built her reputation on aggressive cost-cutting measures, was confronted with evidence that she had specifically targeted employees who had raised concerns about working conditions for those same cost-cutting initiatives. The board's deliberation did not take long, the evidence too clear and too extensive to allow for any real debate about the appropriate course of action, and within the same afternoon a formal vote was called to determine the futures of those implicated. Vanessa Sinclair was removed from her position as Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately, her years of aggressive expansion and impressive quarterly numbers unable to outweigh the mountain of evidence documenting how she had treated the people beneath her on the company's org chart. Gregory Holloway and Patricia Weller followed shortly after, along with two other executives whose conduct had been deemed incompatible with the values the board now insisted would guide the company moving forward. The purge, as some employees would later privately call it, was swift, thorough, and, to almost everyone who had ever felt the sting of these executives' contempt, deeply satisfying. Word of what had happened spread through Holloway Tower with remarkable speed, moving from floor to floor in hushed, disbelieving conversations that grew louder and more animated as the day wore on. Employees who had never exchanged more than a passing nod with Marcus now found themselves replaying every interaction they had ever had with him, searching their memories for clues they had somehow missed, for the moments when the truth of who he was might have been visible if only they had known to look. Sophie Ramirez, who had defended him without hesitation weeks earlier, felt a complicated mixture of pride and disbelief when she learned the truth, though she would later say that nothing about the revelation changed how she felt about the man himself, only how much respect she had for the choice he had made to walk among them unrecognized. Claire Dawson, the young receptionist who had watched Vanessa's cruelty with quiet discomfort that first morning, found herself near tears when the news reached the front desk, not from shock, but from a strange, profound relief that the small kindnesses she had always tried to extend to Marcus had, in some way, been noticed and mattered. She would later tell colleagues that she had never treated him differently because of his job title, that she had simply liked him as a person, and that learning the truth only confirmed something she had already sensed without being able to name it. Throughout the building, similar stories emerged, employees recalling moments of unexpected kindness, patient advice, or quiet wisdom offered by a man they had assumed knew nothing beyond how to open a door. In the days that followed, as the company began the delicate process of restructuring its leadership and addressing the cultural failures Marcus's evidence had exposed, a question began to circulate among employees and board members alike about what role Marcus himself intended to take going forward. Many assumed he would reclaim the chief executive position he had once held decades earlier, stepping back into full control of the company he had built from nothing, and there were certainly those on the board who would have welcomed exactly that outcome without hesitation. Marcus, however, made clear in a private meeting with Harold and the remaining board members that this was not the path he intended to walk. He explained that his purpose in returning had never been about reclaiming power or reasserting control over daily operations, and that the company needed fresh leadership capable of steering it forward, rather than an aging founder attempting to relive decisions made 3 decades earlier. Instead, he asked to be granted the largely symbolic but deeply meaningful role of Chairman Emeritus, a position that would allow him to remain connected to the company's direction and values without occupying the seat of daily authority. He would advise when asked, he said, and would remain available to the board for matters of significant importance, but the day-to-day running of Holloway Corporation belonged to someone with fresh vision and the energy to match it. The board's search for a new chief executive began almost immediately, and Marcus insisted on being closely involved in the process, though not for the reasons some board members initially expected. He was not interested primarily in candidates with the most impressive resumes or the most aggressive growth strategies, and he made this clear from the very first round of interviews conducted in the weeks following Vanessa's departure. Instead, he asked a single question of every candidate that many found unusual for an interview of this magnitude, a question that had nothing to do with quarterly projections or market expansion strategies. He asked each candidate how they treated people who could do nothing for their career, people whose favor could not advance them and whose disfavor could not hold them back, and he watched closely, not just for their answers, but for the way they answered, for the hesitation or ease with which they responded to a question they had clearly not prepared for. Several impressive candidates faltered on this single question, offering polished but hollow responses that made clear they had never seriously considered the treatment of receptionists, security guards, and maintenance staff as relevant to their qualifications for leadership. One candidate, a woman named Diane Foster, who had built a respected but relatively modest career at a mid-sized logistics company, answered differently. Diane told Marcus, without hesitation and without polish, that she believed the true measure of a leader was found not in how they treated their equals or their superiors, but in how they treated everyone else, and that she had spent her career trying to remember the names of every person who kept her workplace running, from the custodial staff to the delivery drivers. She spoke of a mentor early in her career, a warehouse supervisor who had taught her that respect given freely, and without expectation of return, was the only kind of respect that meant anything at all. Marcus listened to her answer in silence, and something in his expression, quiet as it remained, suggested that he had found exactly what he had been searching for. Diane Foster was appointed Chief Executive Officer of Holloway Corporation 6 weeks after Vanessa's departure, and her first act in the role was not a bold strategic announcement or a sweeping restructuring plan, but a simple, personal visit to every department in the building, including the maintenance staff working the overnight shift and the security guards stationed at every entrance. She introduced herself by first name, asked each person about their work and their concerns, and made a promise that she intended to keep, a promise that no one in this company would ever again be made to feel invisible or unworthy of basic respect. Employees who had grown cynical after years of empty corporate promises found themselves, cautiously and slowly, beginning to believe her. Marcus continued to visit Holloway Tower in the weeks and months that followed, though never again in the guise of a security guard, and the changes in how he was received were impossible to ignore. Employees who had once walked past him without a second glance now stood a little straighter when he entered a room, not out of fear or obligation, but out of genuine respect for a man whose quiet integrity had reshaped the culture of an entire company. Executives who had never bothered to learn his name now greeted him warmly, some with a lingering trace of embarrassment they could never quite shake off, no matter how much time had passed since the revelation. On one particular morning, months after the events that had upended so much of the company's leadership, Marcus walked through the lobby of Holloway Tower, dressed not in the uniform he had worn for so long, but in a simple, well-tailored suit that suited his quiet dignity far better than any expensive fabric ever could. He paused near the entrance, watching the morning rush of employees moving through the revolving doors, and something about the scene seemed to please him in a way that no boardroom victory ever quite matched. He noticed, near the front desk, a new employee struggling with an armful of boxes, clearly new enough to the building that she had not yet learned which door opened easiest. Without hesitation, Marcus crossed the lobby and held the door for her, steadying the top box as it threatened to slide from her grip, and the young woman, embarrassed and grateful in equal measure, thanked him with a slight bow of her head, calling him sir out of simple courtesy rather than any recognition of who he was. Marcus smiled at her, the same patient smile he had offered every person who had ever passed through that door, and told her gently that she need not thank him for a title or a position, because titles came and went, and meant very little in the end. What mattered, he said, was simply that they were both human beings, sharing the same small moment in a very large world, and that this, more than any job title or corner office, was worth remembering. The young woman nodded, though she would only understand the full weight of his words later that day, when a coworker told her, in hushed and disbelieving tones, exactly who the man holding the door had been. She would carry that small exchange with her for years afterward, retelling it to new employees whenever the story of Marcus Carter came up, which it inevitably did, usually accompanied by the same disbelieving shake of the head that seemed to follow anyone hearing it for the first time. The door closed quietly behind them both, the sound swallowed by the ordinary hum of a Monday morning, indistinguishable from any other door closing in any other building in the city. Years later, long after Diane Foster had led Holloway Corporation through a period of steady, principled growth that surprised even the analysts who had once doubted her appointment, the company would still be remembered in certain circles, not primarily for its earnings or its expansion into new markets, but for the culture it had rebuilt from the ground up following one extraordinary morning. New employees during their first week were told the story as a kind of unofficial orientation, passed from one department to the next with small variations, but the same essential truth at its core, a reminder that the way a person treated someone with no power to reward or punish them said more about their character than any resume or title ever could. Marcus himself rarely spoke of that morning again, preferring instead to let the changes he had witnessed speak for themselves, content in the knowledge that the company now carried forward the values he had first imagined for it so many years before. And yet, something about that particular door, and the man who had once stood beside it in a worn uniform watching the world pass by, seemed to linger in the memory of everyone who had witnessed even a small part of his story. It was not the wealth he had built, or the company that bore the quiet mark of his original vision that people remembered most vividly when they spoke of him afterward. It was the stillness with which he had absorbed every insult, the patience with which he had waited for the truth to reveal itself on its own terms, and the simple, unshakable belief that had guided him through it all, a belief that status might earn a person deference, but that only the way someone treated those who could offer them nothing in return ever truly revealed who they were.